Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. A couple of days away now for the Imola Grand Prix, but major dominoes falling in the F1 world today. Alex Albon confirming his contract status for the coming couple of years, but also Stefano Domenicali telling all on many topics in the F1 world. The key one of note today being the sprint races, confirming absolutely they will increase the number of sprint races next season. How many is possible? Could it be all the way up to 25? Very much intrigued your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. But first of all, here we have it from Alex Albon. Confirms today that he will be extending his contract with Williams, not just for 1 year, but actually for 2 more years. This is a very interesting piece of news, actually, because what it says about Williams, but also potentially what it says about Albon. There were rumours a while ago that Albon was on the interest list of 4 to 5 teams. Last year, the feeling was Ferrari were quite possibly going to get Albon, and maybe that would have happened had Hamilton not joined, because Fred Vasseur and Albon, they also have a good relationship, and there was a feeling that he probably wouldn't stay at Williams, and that potentially Ferrari were going to get him. Then it was quite clear, of course, that obviously Red Bull wanted Albon. They even said to Albon a couple of months ago now, and this has been confirmed by various sources, they gave Albon an offer to join them as a first right of refusal. So basically Albon would say, okay, if you want me in 2026, you can have me, but it's not actually Red Bull's. They didn't have to do that, Red Bull, right? So I kind of saw that at the time, was like, why would Albon say yes to this? It's basically saying, yeah, sure, I want to join Red Bull again, but Red Bull don't have the necessity to actually bring him on. But it did indicate interest from Red Bull to bring him back into their stable, and Helmut Marko has said this before as well. So now that's not going to be the case. He's staying at Williams. The Ferrari thing disappeared, the Red Bull thing disappeared, and therefore I guess Albon has been left with this as effectively his best option. I do wonder if there's anything to do with it, the season so far, because compared to Sargent, he's not had, he's had a good season so far compared to Sargent, but that's, Sargent tax, whatever you want to say. He's not been as, good this year as he was last year, at least for the start, but the car isn't as good. I think that's the key point. You can only be as good as the car is capable of delivering, and Albon and the rest of the team know they sacrificed a lot with this car over the winter to try and improve their processes, to get off this whole making everything on Excel that they've used for the last 20 years, and Val's is like, oh my god, we're 20 years behind the technology here. We've got to change, and this year's car was, in some sense, sacrificed over the winter in order to ensure that they can make progress going forwards. So there's 2 ways. Either Albon is very confident in Williams and their progress going forward and believes that is the best option, because it certainly says something about James Vowles and what he's building, that Albon is, committed to a multi-year contract extension. He's already been there quite some time. That is going to continue for some time to come. And also, I think Vowles mentioned this a while ago now, that he didn't really want to have changes in the lineup between 25 and 26, because there's so many other changes. If you change the lineup as well, not optimal, right? So ideally, the teams will probably try and keep the same lineup between 25 and 26 when the new regulations arrive, which meant that he's tried to get Albon to lock down an extension, obviously. Now, I think Val said that, look, if Albon got the Red Bull offer and wants to go, then he can go. But if that doesn't happen, Albon sees Williams as the most sensible option for the time being. Mercedes are probably not going to give him an offer, and it's on the downhill, and Williams makes a fair bit of sense. They seem to be making some progress. They can score points, not particularly often, but sometimes they do, and Albon seems to believe that, potentially in 2026 and beyond, this is a good platform to still build on, and, it's a nice, comfortable environment. He's the number 1 guy by a margin. He doesn't have to go to Red Bull and get potentially beaten up by Max Verstappen again, but it is interesting that Albon wasn't that long ago, we felt like he was in a prime position to secure a top drive, whether at Red Bull or Mercedes or Ferrari or, one of the teams up there. But the fact that now those offers have disappeared and, obviously his crash in Australia, there were some rumours going around that since he'd had a kind of poor start to the season, especially the Australia thing, the crash, and then he takes Sargent's car and, had a good race but didn't score points at the end, some of the other teams kind of said, all right, what, we're not so sure about this Albon guy, and therefore, they bode their time, and now this is the thing that makes most sense for Albon to do. But, just worthy of note, really, it's another confirmation on the driver lineup for next season. This is all we know so far, and it still isn't really much, is it? Let's be honest, given where we are in the season. But Albon is confirmed to stay at Williams. The other driver there is, not going to be Sargent, as far as I'm concerned, but time will only tell. Couple of updates as well on what is happening in Imola. We have some new upgrades, of course, to the cars. Mercedes are not bringing a new front wing, but there was discussion if in Formula Uno that actually that innovative front wing concept we talked about at the start of the season has actually been causing them problems, which is kind of interesting to think about, isn't it? Because the start of the year, one of the big talking points was this front wing concept where is especially noticeable here on Spec 1 actually, where usually this kind of element at the top of the wing will connect all the way along to the front wing nose. But Mercedes found a way to use a very small piece of wire to connect it to the front wing, and therefore technically it's a connected element and is not separate as they were in the Y150 Vortex days, but still create more of a gap here to generate more vorticity in the front wing design. This seemed to be, a solid idea. Other teams hadn't thought about it. Other teams even potentially tried to get it banned. But maybe there's a reason why other teams haven't really explored this option, because maybe it just isn't very good. And of the versions that Mercedes have trialed on this, apparently they've suffered problems as a result. They've done a couple of things with the flaps on the front wing to try and change it around and ensure better efficiency, but it's not really working. And apparently big developments are going to be delayed because Brackley, as in the factory at Mercedes, are trying to figure out what is even the right direction here. And this is the big concern at Mercedes. If you're Red Bull, if you're McLaren, if you're certainly Ferrari potentially right now, you seem to know where your car is good, where your car is bad, and therefore what to do to fix it. This is the problem that Mercedes have, is that they know they're not quick enough, right? They know they're too slow, but they don't really know what to do. And they're still working out in the factory what they even do with this front wing. It's why, look, they brought a floor upgrade. They brought, some side pod changes or whatever. They brought some new beam wing and new rear wing to this Grand Prix in Imola. No front wing, no new front wing yet, which is a part that they do like to bring halfway through the season at Silverstone or something. But apparently they don't really know what they're going to build for that new front wing because they're not really sure what's actually going to fix their problem. So yeah, I don't know if there's any saving this Mercedes team, and maybe for a similar reason why Adrian Newey has said, yeah, maybe you give us a cautious approach now, but it ain't going to make much difference. And that was reported by AMUS and has been kind of further elaborated on today, that Mercedes were not so interested in Newey a while ago, and now over the last couple of weeks they've now made more cautious approaches to Newey to be like, okay, please, we do need you, but Newey ain't interested is the going line at the moment. He probably will go to Ferrari if he goes anywhere, as we discussed yesterday. This is the Ferrari new rear wing. I thought it was interesting to note that it's basically the same rear wing in terms of the design, apart from the rear wing element, of course, which is now far sharper than it previously was, which is, Red Bull have done something similar to this, as have other teams. They've also changed up the entrance to the cooling at the back here. They used to have like a big spot. Now they've just got kind of like this small little gap here they're using, so that's interesting to note. But the rear wing is considerably different in, the way it appears, with the very sharp lines and edges here. Now, what interests me is that I didn't know if this was still going to be possible. You guys remember the pre-2022 cars, when all of the rear wings and the front wings were very sharp lines, right? The purpose of that is because it creates vortexes behind the car which generate downforce, but they severely limit the ability of a following car to follow. So when the regulations arrived in 2022, they brought along a much more rounded wing model. I mean, obviously this is an example here of a 2021 AlphaTauri with all the sharp lines, and then the 2022 car with all, the nice curved lines which are not as effective in terms of generating dirty air for the car behind. I mean, the slipstream isn't also as powerful, but it has, generally speaking, a better effect on performance in terms of racing quality. So what do we think about the fact that now it seems to be realized that the teams can still kind of make a lot of these elements very sharp and, very cut off edges? We've seen other teams exploring this over the last couple of years, and maybe it's inevitable that the rear wings have gone from looking like the bottom here to now looking far more like the top version, even with, there's still some of the shapes there. But now Ferrari are realizing, well, we can do this. Maybe there's a loophole or something that allows them to do so, and the FIA aren't really cracking down on it, right? This is the thing that kind of confuses me. There's all this talk about spirit of the regulations, but the FIA have basically said, yeah, we know that teams are using loopholes to create more dirty air and downforce, but of course, it's hurting the racing, chasing this performance. But the FIA, Nicolas Tombazis, said, well, we probably ain't going to do anything about it until 2026 because we're kind of too far gone at this point and we're focused on the next step. So, the FIA, the kind of decision makers over there are really focused on the 2026 regulations. So the teams are kind of free to exploit all of these loopholes, even if they may be contrary to the spirit of the regulations, because no one's going to stop them right now. The police just are not on the streets, it turns out, when coming to this stuff. So why not use what is available to be used? Speaking of the FIA, they've had some discussions recently with F1 themselves. There's also discussion that penalties, such as for Magnussen, right? When Magnussen cut the corner, cut the chicane to gain a competitive advantage so that he could stay ahead of Hamilton down the straight, Obviously, antics, right, and racing IQ, you might want to say, but probably not something that should be incentivized, as in some sense Magnussen potentially was to do so. The matter is going to be discussed in Imola about a potential drive-through penalty. This is what I've been talking about now for some time. Bring back the drive-through. Like, this is how it used to be. The penalty used to be either as fitting for the crime or harsher than the crime. That should, I don't think the punishment should necessarily fit the crime. I think the punishment should be harsher than the crime so that there's no incentive to actually do so. Because for Magnussen, in many cases this season, he's been incentivized to take a penalty because it's going to benefit the team. And there's other drivers that have been in similar positions as well. A drive-through means that if you cut the chicane to stay ahead, you'll be ordered within 3 laps to serve a drive-through penalty. So it forces that driver out of the way. If someone goes off track or pushes a driver off track to maintain a position they are not belonging to, and the steward say, okay, 5-second penalty, you serve that at the next pit stop. 10-second penalty, 20-second penalty, you serve that at the next pit stop. Maybe there isn't one, you serve it at the end of the race, then you just sit back and hold up the field because they can't get by. Whereas a drive-through forces the driver out of the way, so if they were unfairly in that position, they are mandated to give it up because they're forced to go through the pits. So I'm down for that. And apparently, despite all the drama lately between Mohammed Ben Sulayem, between the FIA, Formula 1 of course, they have apparently agreed to commit to a strategic plan for the future of Formula 1. The World Championship has never been so strong and is growing globally, etc, etc. To that end, both parties are developing a new strategic plan that will allow us to seize the opportunities and further enhance the potential. So basically, they're trying to find peace somewhat between the two parties. Potentially accepting that realistically, they're not going to be leaving the FIA to run their own sport with another governing body or something. Like, it still will be the FIA Formula 1 World Championship, but there's been so much controversy between the respective owners and leaders that something had to give at some point, and maybe what it's going to be giving is that they're actually going to concede things and they're going to compromise. But I don't know if I really trust these two organizations to find peace. But speaking of Ben Sulayem, and of course this man, his kind of counterpart in some ways of Formula 1, Stefano Domenicali, he has had a lot to say on the state of Formula 1 at the moment, and especially interesting on Red Bull and also the sprint races. So this is what he had to say. A couple of interesting pieces here, one of which on the Red Bull family, right? Because we know that Zak Brown especially has been giving lots of thoughts, and probably for good reason, on the Red Bull RB AlphaTauri relationship. Now, people talk about Haas Ferrari, people talk about Williams Mercedes, and understandably so, but Mercedes don't own Williams. They have a relationship with Williams, absolutely. They sell them engines, and, James Vowles, there's engineers that have passed between the two of them. It's a relationship, same with Haas and Ferrari. Haas buy a lot of stuff off Ferrari, basically everything they can. Red Bull, however, they literally own 2 teams. And this was the debate that Zak Brown was having, that is it fair that you can own 2 teams? What is the conflict of interest there? I don't think it should be allowed, possibly. I think probably most fans agree that in an ideal world, we shouldn't have 2 teams owned by one organisation, as Red Bull GmbH do own both of those teams, and that creates lots of potential recipe for conflict of interest. Whether there's anything actually happening there is another question, but also there's that idea that they're closely collaborating. They're going to move lots of the RB facilities to Milton Keynes next to the main team. How do we know if there's no information sharing happening there that shouldn't be? We don't. Can the FIA probably police it? I don't trust that they can. So these are the issues. And Zak Brown has said, yeah, we need to stop that. We should mandate it not to be possible. Now, several years ago, when there wasn't enough money around to actually finance another team, it was fair play to Red Bull actually doing so. Funding 2 teams was commendable given the circumstances, that if they hadn't done so, that team may no longer exist. But in the modern day, when the teams are worth a lot of money, it probably shouldn't be possible in my opinion. But Domenicali says, we also talked about the fact the Red Bull brand now owns 2 teams, but they can simply continue in this way based on what they have meant to the sport in history. So very interesting. You're basically saying, yeah, they wouldn't really care. They've done a lot for the sport, so Red Bull can do what they want type thing. So very interesting statement. This is the other piece though. We know that the limit on races is 25. There's currently 24. I imagine they will want to push that to the absolute limit and maybe beyond over the coming years, because the more races, the more money. It's basically how it works. Like Liberty are looking for profits. They've got shareholders to satisfy. It's understandable. It is what it is. But the decisions they are making may be good for shareholder value in the short term. Are they good for shareholder value in the long term? If the fan base is not particularly happy, if the sport starts to regress somewhat as a result of these decisions, there is a debate on that. But in the short term, they believe more races, more sprints good for the sport because, well, it's funny how Domenicali words it. We can confirm the maximum races will remain at 25, but we are going to organise more sprint races. That way we make the race weekends even more exciting. So, maybe what he meant to say was even more profitable, but yeah, I guess exciting is the word that came out of his mouth. Now, last May, this is literally a year ago now, he made the point that he has no plans to introduce a sprint on every race weekend. He said that he would like to do a third. So there's currently 6 of 24. He would want to make that 8 of 24. Now, I would not be surprised if when we see what they're actually going to do, it's more than 8. Right. I feel like based on his words there that they will introduce more sprints. There's even been talk, could they do a sprint in every round, right? MotoGP is thriving as a sport at the moment and is arguably in the best place it's been in for a long time. They introduced sprints everywhere not that long ago. And do people watch sprints more often than they watch free practice? Yeah, sure, and there's an argument to say that, we got to move with the times and introduce sprint races. I really think there's more that needs to be done with the format. Verstappen made his points very clear on this last year and has done many a time again, and even Lando Norris recently said that he doesn't like the sprints. The vast majority of drivers don't like the sprint races, but for various reasons, to be honest. But Verstappen says, yeah, I don't get excited by the sprints. Now we've done this race, everyone more or less knows what's going to happen tomorrow. If I were a fan, I'd be very disappointed. It takes away the magic of waking up on a Sunday morning and you're not sure what car is going to be quickest, which is still a problem, I believe, even though they've changed the Parc Fermé rules. But I will say that after the sprint in Miami, it looked like, yeah, Verstappen's going to win again, no problem on the Sunday. But both teams, made some setup changes, worked out for McLaren, they won the race. But the vast majority of times, you get the occasional sprint, which is good. The fact that sprint was a thing in China and therefore we got that phenomenal sprint qualifying, that was great. But, so I do see the value. Maybe I wouldn't say I'm coming round to it because I'm not, but I do believe some of the changes that have been made to the sprint format have probably been for the better in recent times. And if they are going to add more, then at least the new format I think is probably better in some ways to make it a little bit more interesting. But yeah, what do you guys think about that, right? Sprints, more sprints, first of all. So we go 6 this year. It will definitely be at least 8 next year based on what he's saying. It might be 10, might be 12, might be 25. I mean, honestly, who knows at this point? But that would be so much effort for everyone involved. But, if it's going to make more money, then that's what F1 are going to look into doing. He also said that they will not be expanding points to all of the points finishes, right? Because we know that as it stands, you get points for 10th and, of course, the fastest lap point if you're in 10, if you're in the top 10 and get the fastest lap as well. They might go to 12, but they're not going to go to all of them, which I think is probably fine. And arguably the one positive thing that he mentioned here, though, was on the engine rules in 2030, because it's apparently F1 are considering basically increasing the noise. It's a big talking point, I think, that the cars just don't sound good enough nowadays. They don't sound like they did in the, the V12, the V8 days, for example. People want more noise. People also want the cars to look faster on TV. I saw a pole position lap of Kimi Räikkönen doing the rounds on social media from the early 2000s where he stuck it on pole in a McLaren that looked spectacular, but also the camera angles were quite far away. And that meant the car looked really fast. Nowadays, I think there's a bit of an obsession with having the camera angles really close into the cars, like zooming in a lot, because then the sponsors get their airtime, right? Whereas the cars look faster, for sure, when it's a wider angle camera that can see more of the backgrounds, rather than like zooming in on the car and you don't quite get the full picture. So I think that's part of it as well. But yeah, this is positive to me. And of course, there's been further talk as well here, for example, in this reply, is that, I think it will happen, that moving away from the hybrid engine will happen at some point. I don't think we're going to have hybrids anymore in Formula 1. In hindsight, it probably should have happened in 2026. It ain't going to happen. It's going to be 50-50. But in 2030, there is a realistic possibility internal combustion returns in full with sustainable fuels, and that might well be the future of this sport. At least that's been the talking point for some time, and at least Formula 1 are apparently considering the possibility. But very much into your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.